Miles Davis's second great quintet, which of course includes Ron Carter on bass, has many, many unbelievably good recordings. One that I keep coming back to, and that I know a lot of other people do too, is a live double album called My Funny Valentine and Four and More. And as I say, a live recording, and everything's recorded really, really well, and everybody is playing excellently. And so I thought, let's take a minute and listen to an excerpt of Ron Carter's bass line on There Is No Greater Love, which is certainly a standard you've probably encountered before. So let's do that now. Welcome to Learn Jazz Bass with Matt Rybicki. I'm glad that you're here. You know, if you like what we do here on the channel, I wanted to invite you to participate in my new course that's going to be released on November 4th. It's called Jazz Bass 101, Walking Essential Tunes, and we cover lots of fundamental forms that are important in thousands of jazz tunes. One thing that is important in these tunes are cycles of fourths, and we go into a deep dive in that in one section of the course. And There Is No Greater Love is a tune that we reference. In fact, we talk about this particular transcription from Ron Carter. So please do check that out on November 4th. I hope you'll join me there to get into an even deeper dive of the kinds of things we're talking about here with Ron Carter. So for a short excerpt here, I think there is a lot to look at in just these two choruses of There Is No Greater Love. I mean, there's a whole bunch of sort of big things and some very, very minute things that are worth checking out. You know, when you listen to this original recording, if you're not familiar with it already, and I really, really encourage you to listen to the original recording, you'll hear that in this first chorus that we're playing, which is about 2.5 minutes into the tune, Tony Williams on drums and Herbie Hancock on piano, they drop out, or stroll. That's sometimes slang. To drop out is to stroll. And so it's just Ron Carter on bass and Miles Davis soloing. And that gives us a chance to hear Ron Carter much, much better. And also it gives Ron a chance to put a lot of kinds of different colors in there that we may miss when we're hearing sort of everybody playing together. Some broad things to think about are just how many times Ron does not play the root on the downbeat of a chord. If we want to learn how to not be locked in to playing downbeats on chords, on roots on downbeats, excuse me, Ron is a guide for that, and this is a great guide for that. How do we actively and accurately and musically make that happen? It occurs all over the place in just these two choruses, and it is certainly something that Ron is a master of. You know, he is also a master of articulations, and we've got a lot of those here for sure. I want to get into them in a second, but I also want to talk about some other sort of broad things. He has some examples here that I will point out where there is some sort of harmonic expansion or contraction. So where the chord is sort of supposed to happen, he is either delaying that, subverting it entirely, or extending it so that it goes into the next place where a change should happen. That is pretty cool for sure. Some minor things that we're looking at, I mentioned that, you know, it gives him a chance to put a lot of colors in there, and a lot of that has to do with Ron's command of the instrument and his ability to have a whole host of kinds of articulations. One main thing is the length of his notes, which I may have mentioned before. You probably heard other people mention. He's got very, very long notes, and purposefully, many times while he plays, he will cause one note to bleed into the next one, essentially creating a double stop. Like, for example, if we look at measure 5 right from the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4. Did you hear that it went into the next note? C, D, I hold the D down the whole time, play the G while the D is held. And this kind of idea happens over and over and over again in his playing, and it really adds a lot of color because we're getting sort of two notes at once, aren't we? Speaking of two notes at once, there's something I noticed on this go around of me reattaching myself and reconnecting to this transcription that I hadn't noticed before. In the end of bar 9, going into bar 10, when he's just by himself with Miles, he actually fits in a double stop that is a major third in there that I had not heard before. He's playing the open G and the E flat at the same time. So if we look at measure 9, 1, 2, 3, 4. Isn't that neat? I never had really noticed it before, and I was so just tickled to hear it, for lack of a better word. I was excited to hear this new thing I hadn't heard before. And there's a whole bunch of other places where he is adding color with his articulations. Besides these long notes, besides creating sort of essentially double stops, he has a variety of ways that he is executing triplets and pull-offs. You know, I may have mentioned this in another video as well. I know other people have, talking about a way of playing triplets that aren't as distinct or discrete from one another. It becomes much more of bleeding into one another. And Ron does that, where a triplet drop will sort of all be together in one great sort of swoop, so that they're all sort of ringing. But then if we look at, for example, measure 29, it's very clear on the recording that he is essentially putting his whole palm down and stopping all the strings, so they all become essentially like an X almost, right? Like almost a ghosted note. Like that. It's super clear on the recording. So he is, as I say, a master of this instrument and can control when he wants these long and short notes. You'll notice that I marked in some articulations, as I usually don't, in some places that it's very, very clear on the recording that he is playing a note staccato, for example. We see that in measure 32 and in measure 2 and so on. There's other places where he is very, very clearly doing something that has to do with adding some color. He's got this little slide in measure 14. That's not just an accident. He's doing that on purpose and very, very controlled. I love everything he's doing here, including the ability for him, or the demonstration of him to have the ability and the mastery of being able to make leaps in his bass lines that are quite large compared to what we normally hear we're supposed to do. We normally hear, and I have said, we want to keep our notes pretty close together as far as the register. You don't want to make a big leap unless it makes sense or it's musical. And Ron's make sense and they're musical. I mean, one extreme example of this, and which also combines this idea of holding out a note into the next to create a double stop, is going right into the bridge. So from measure 16 into measure 17 and then on to 18. If I play measure 16, 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, that's a whole lot of stuff happening there, isn't it? Two notes happening simultaneously a couple times in there. The C and the A happening at the same time. Then he goes to the lowest note, the E natural, which is not part of that chord technically, but Herbie isn't there to correct him. Then up to nearly thumb position, this F sharp here, which then he holds into the open D as well. So he is getting that sound of the D7 there as well. So he's sort of defining the qualities of the A minor and the D7 with these open strings and using the chord tones and jumping registers in a super, super effective way. You can find other places where he is also using leaps of octaves that make a lot of sense, especially when you think about fingering. If we look at measure 25 going into measure 26, check out what he's doing here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's very, very clear, like if we were doing sort of Simandl fingering, we would be jumping around like this. But he plays this first note in 25, the F natural. He plays that short for sure. And my guess is that he is playing that with his fourth finger because of where he's coming from. F with the fourth finger, but short, so that it gives him time to move his hand to this position, what would be called different positions, whether you're Simandl or whatever fingering you're using. But he is here where his fourth finger is on E flat. And then that opens up these things to play on the E flat 7 and on the A flat 7, which comes next. He plays E flat, B flat, D natural, which is the E flat 7, but he's basically an approach note going back to E flat on A flat 7. And then he's able to move down with the open G there. So it's clear in a couple places that he is using the leaps effectively and in connection with effective fingerings so that it makes it sound logical, sound right in terms of tone and timbre, but also logically lead from one thing to the next, which is what we want, despite there being leaps. And you can tell too some of his fingering because you can't hold out some of those notes into the others unless you're fingering it a certain way. Like the first example I played, C, D, I can't hold this D and play an open G. I must play it close. So he's clearly playing it that way. There's no other way to play it that I can think of. I don't think he's doing that. Nonetheless, that is a cool thing to notice. As I mentioned, he is able to mess around with the harmonic rhythm. And if we look at one way of delaying sort of the expression of the chord, we can find that in measures 3 and 7 and 25 and 36 and 42, where he is taking some time before he gets to sort of defining what the chord actually is, or what the sound should be, quote unquote. And he plays with this as well. Like, if one really strong example to me is in measure 36, the chord normally would move to a G flat, a G7. Basically, broadly, that sound would move to a G7, but he's playing A flat and B flat on beats 1 and 2. What's happening there? Well, when you listen in context, you understand he's just extending the A flat 7 that came before it into the next bar. And then he plays GD on beats 3 and 4 of measure 36. So then he's getting to that G7. So it's almost like that bar in 36 is really A flat 7 for beats 1 and 2, and then G7 for beats 3 and 4. And he plays with this in different places as well, sometimes doing away with sort of what the chords are all together. If we look at measure 53, this is a minor 2-5 going to G minor 7 in the bridge. He starts at B, B natural on an A minor 7 flat 5, B flat, A, that A fits the D7, but D flat. What his real intention is to get to the G. So that's all he's trying to do, is get to the G on the downbeat there. So he has this great ability, as I may have mentioned before, to be able to push and pull the expectations, but always land the plane, so to speak, or always fulfill where it's going to go, even if it might seem confusing at first. That is certainly an example of that. You know, there's a couple other places where he sort of does away with thinking about what the chords should be. One place would be in 21, where there is, again, this minor 2-5, and he plays 1, 2, 3, 4. So like, that sounds to me like it belongs as a minor 2-5. I'm not exactly sure why it works as that, because it doesn't really fulfill the expected sound of what should be under those chords, A minor 7 flat 5 and D7. And also, if we look at measure 43, there should be, quote unquote, an A flat 7 here, or maybe a D7, but he plays A natural, B flat, A natural again, G. So my only guess there would be that he is now expanding or contracting the harmonic rhythm the other way. So instead of playing A flat there, there's a G7 coming up. He's basically sort of moving the G7-ish sound, or G sound, into that bar. So before he delayed it, and now he's pushing it earlier. I'm not exactly sure what the thought is there, but when you listen to it, especially in context with him actually playing it, not me, it sounds so right and so expected and so exactly what should be there. All this stuff is exactly what should be there when one understands the tune as well as he does. Of course, he's a master of hundreds of thousands of aspects of musicianship, but certainly one thing he knows very well is what a tune is and how the harmony works in a tune. Understanding something like the function or the structure of There Is No Greater Love is a great source of data for how we can make decisions about what we're playing with our bass lines. Essentially, these first 4 bars of the A sections could be thought of like a cycle of 4s, even though the chord qualities aren't always the same depending on who's playing it, and the chords aren't always the same. But it comes from the same basic place in all the different interpretations, that there is this sound that's moving in a certain direction, generally up a fourth, that Ron knows very, very well. And so he's able to play with that because he knows where the important parts are and he knows what the ultimate ending is of where it's supposed to go. So I hope this offered a little bit of insight into some ideas for you as to what you might stick in when you play There Is No Greater Love. And remembering that understanding the form of the tune is going to be very, very helpful for allowing you to be free to make these kinds of colorful decisions. I hope this is something that you can get from taking my course. Jazz Bass 101, Walking Essential Tunes. We talk a lot about the underlying structure of tunes so that we better understand how to empower ourselves to make great lines. Thanks for joining me today. I'm glad that you were here. Please like, subscribe, look for PDF below. Always remember, straight ahead and strive for tone.